The Lincoln Park Community Research Initiative, a partnership of local community organizations, businesses, and DePaul University, works to collect, document, and preserve the shared history of Lincoln Park and DePaul University. Among the initiative's research and educational programs is the Voices and Visions Project, which gathers oral histories of the neighborhood. Because the buildings of Lincoln Park provide a rich record of architectural and cultural development, part of the Voices and Visions Project investigates the history and the role of several of Lincoln Park's most memorable and significant buildings. We believe that studying and preserving our built environment will help us to understand the vibrant communities that have settled, struggled, and thrived here. To begin, the members of the Community Research Initiative chose to investigate 3 buildings: Yondarf Hall on busy, ever-changing North Avenue, Lincoln Turner Hall to the north, and the Belden Stratford Hotel, overlooking the park on Lincoln Park West. Different in age, in architectural style, and in purpose, the 3 buildings provide a broad overview of the communities that settled Lincoln Park in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the scenes that follow, historians, architects, and current members of the Lincoln Park community offer information and reminiscences of these iconic buildings. In researching the history of each of these sites from their beginnings to the present day and examining their importance to the neighborhood in which they were built, we realized that we must also look at the history of the German community in Lincoln Park. Since the Germans were the largest ethnic group in the neighborhood, they were most often the inhabitants or patrons of these buildings. As John Jentz makes clear in the first interview segment, understanding the history of German immigration to Chicago is crucial to understanding the early history of Yondarf Hall and other sites. Our project illustrates the ways in which German immigration and the thriving German community in Lincoln Park shaped the neighborhood's built environment. It also shows how these structures helped define the neighborhood for years to come. German immigrants were notable for their efforts to form communities, to support one another, and do things together, whether in church worship, social and political activities, or recreation. Yondarf Hall and the Lincoln Turner Building are 2 visible expressions of this German inclination to community. We'll start on busy North Avenue with its shops and businesses. Here, near the L tracks, is one of the few remaining Victorian-era public halls in Chicago. The 4-story Yandorf Hall was designed by architect Friedrich Alschlager in 1887 for 2 German-Jewish clothing merchants, Charles and August Yandorf. The Yandorf brothers, who started their own business, Yandorf Clothing, in 1872, owned a clothing shop down the street at 267 North Avenue. Nearby Yandorf Hall was designed to provide commercial real estate on the ground floor and meeting spaces and social halls on the upper floors. A public hall at the end of the 19th century in working-class Chicago offered a cheap and easily accessible place for political meetings, drinks, and socializing. Yandorf Hall undoubtedly supplied all these needs, and its location made it a hub of its immigrant community. The building has survived many changes in its neighborhood. Indeed, its survival has often been in doubt. Around 1900, the Northwestern Railroad built its elevated tracts around the hall, not to preserve the building, but because the path through the alleys and side streets was the easiest and least expensive route for the trains. The hall continued to be a popular site where fraternal, social, and political groups held meetings, public forums, and parties. In time, however, particularly during the Depression and World War II, the hall fell out of use. Its German community scattered, and both economic and community pressures worked against the hall's original functions. Evidence is scarce, but it seems that Yondarf Hall sat empty from late 1935 until 1958. The ground floor then reopened as Sam's Cut Rate Liquors. Although a partial rejuvenation of the site, and one in keeping with its earlier social functions, much of the structure was left in disrepair. At one point in the 1960s, the city proposed demolishing it to widen North Avenue. But once again, the building was spared when those plans were dropped. Demolition went on elsewhere, however. In 1973, 4 structures between Yondarf Hall and the elevated tracks to the west were demolished, becoming a gravel parking lot for the building. Yondarf Hall itself survived, but continued to decline as its structure and facade aged. Sam and Frank Rosen of Sam's Liquors at one point planned to raise the building to make way for a new store, but ultimately decided to move down the street instead. In 1984, the city of Chicago also began procedures to tear down the building. At this point, preservationists intervened to save the structure, and Vinci Hamp Architects nominated the building to the National Register of Historic Places on November 13, 1984. Tim Glascott, also concerned with the fate of the building, purchased it in 1986, intending to remodel it as a restaurant and bar. But again, these plans fell through and the hall passed into other hands. At last, in 1990, Vinci Hamp Architects undertook a complete renovation of the building, restoring and updating it to meet current building codes, clearing out debris, and discovering traces of the building's earlier history. On July 25, 2001, Yondarf Hall was officially designated a Chicago landmark, and its upper floors have been leased to Steppenwolf Theater as storage and rehearsal space, a happy echo of its earlier role as a space for discussion and debate within the community. Our study of Yondarf Hall's long history is realized here in the words of historian John Jentz, architect Phil Hamp, developer Tim Glascott, and David Schmitz of Steppenwolf Theater.
I thought we might start with just talking about German migration to Chicago in the 19th century.
Okay.
When did it start, and why did it start?
Well, it started from the beginning. I mean, Chicago was founded in 1830s, and there were Germans there at the very beginning, but it really cranked up the German migration to Chicago in the 1850s. There were European-wide democratic revolutionary movements in 1848, and they were repressed over several years. And the repression of those movements basically exported a lot of people, especially the intelligentsia type people, lawyers, journalists, people who have become political activists, ministers, and they are the typical, those are the people you think of typically as 48ers. And they arrived in Chicago, as they did in practically every American city. They helped distinguish the German and German-American culture in the United States because they were highly skilled, trained, mostly politicized to their ears, and they knew how to do newspapers and put on demonstrations and things like that, and it gave the sophistication and vitality of German-American culture in places like Chicago a very surprisingly vibrant character.
Now we're going to wander out onto North Avenue or Halsted Street. Can you kind of give us a feel of the sights, sounds, smells? What would we...
Sights, sounds, and smells. North Avenue, for about half a mile here, was commonly referred to as the German Broadway. And there were two intersections that kind of defined the street as a commercial and social area for German-speaking peoples. And one was Claiborne in North, and the other one was Milwaukee in North. Oh, if you had walked out here in like 1890, this would have been, the normal language on the streets, I think, would have been German. In 1900, there were 470,000 people in Chicago who were either born in Germany or who had one parent born in Germany. There was a heritage of political and social activity by German Catholics. Perhaps, well, the easiest one to cite is Michael Diversey, as in Diversey Avenue. He was a Catholic brewer, and he ran for office. He served in various modest offices, and was a major player on the North Side. And that was before, I think, he was around in the 1850s and maybe even earlier. But it's an indication of the tone and character of the place, that he was both a brewer, an entrepreneur, a politician, good Catholic. And that's often one of the things that surprised the American reporters who reported on them, because they would, okay, so we're going to go. Okay, they sent me to do an account of the Anarchists. And so as an American reporter, and I go and I come in, and I see all these people who are often maybe very well dressed. And there's kids, and no one seems terribly angry. You know, the image of an anarchist would be they're scowling, bearded, threatening people. And there's all these people singing, dancing, drinking, with a variety, intergenerational audience. Yeah.
So the Harper's Weekly would have bearded Karl Marx wannabes, kind of?
Right. And certainly unsavory, dirty, bearded, shaggy, poorly dressed, and almost always male. Right? They're all males. But if you come to an anarchist sponsored commemoration of the Commune, you're going to find intergenerational men and women doing all kinds of different public things that would surprise somebody who expected the bearded, threatening anarchist bomb throwers.
First of all, I'd like to ask you if you can give us a little background on your firm and how you first became acquainted with the Yandorf building.
Sure. Thank you, Ted. It's interesting to participate in the oral history. This is a building that I'm really interested in. It's kind of important in our firm's history. Our firm is Vinci Hamp Architects. It was established by my partner John Vinci back in 1969, and we specialize in preservation work, museum exhibitions, and residential work. But a good part of our work has always been historically based. I have an American Studies degree from University of Michigan, so I come into architecture with a architectural historian's background. I joined John's office in 1980 when I came down from Milwaukee, graduating from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Architecture. And I remember seeing this building first in June of probably 1980. It was a building that was under duress. It was threatened. You may remember, you probably do, it was Sam's Liquor Store, and it had been that for probably since the 1950s. We came up with the idea of thwarting its demolition in a way by getting it on the National Register of Historic Places. I wrote a National Register form for the building, and Pat and I went to see a relative of Fred Rosen's, I think his older brother, and forgetting his name, but he was a lawyer, and he had an office down on LaSalle Street. And we went in because to have a building on the National Register, which is a program run by the National Park Service that documents buildings of significance across the country, not just Chicago, but you generally want to have the owner's consent. So we went and asked Mr. Rosen, the brother, did you mind if we did this? And they said, no, we don't care. Because I think they knew they were kind of going out of the picture. We got it on the National Register in the mid-1980s, and that gives it a measure of protection to a building. By being on the National Register, if any federal funds were used, for example, to widen North Avenue or build the new railroad trestle for the L, you could invoke what's known as a Section 106 review, which is through at the high level of the National Register, which would review the project, how it was impacting this historic resource, and they could ultimately stop a project. So the decision was made that this would be a tax credit project, that they would, since it was on the National Register, they would try to get a rehabilitation tax credit through the federal, through the Park Service, National Park Service. It's administered by the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency and so forth. Tim Glasgow was part and parcel with that, and it was part of his development, so that you get, I think at the time, a 20% tax credit on all components that contribute to the rehabilitation of the building. The building had no active fire stairs, no alarm system, structural things were probably decayed, out of date, inoperable mechanical systems, not air conditioned, and so forth. So the idea was that we designed a saddlebag of function that could be put onto the side so that we could have an elevator, make it accessible. We could have a fire stair on the south side and the north side, and in between is basically mechanical systems that served all the floors. There was a Otis elevator back in the east corner, the northeast corner of the building that was maybe 3 foot square, something like that, metal cage of the 1880s, so it wasn't the first elevator, it was a pretty early elevator that was collapsed down into the basement, and the shaft was there, the elevator was down in a heap. And no one knew what to do with it, but it was in a space that when the building was replanned, the shaft was eliminated and it was made into floor space. My brother at the time was working at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, and I convinced him to see if they wanted this elevator. And so they sent their technology person to come over, and he looked at it and said, yeah. And so the elevator, its equipment, the cab is in the collection of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. I don't think they've ever done anything. My brother subsequently said, I don't know why you ever convinced me to take that thing, but it's an interesting artifact, and it's still extant.
It's a very important part of the history of skyscrapers. The Otis elevators, and they had elevator operators in those years, and it was downtown there are a few buildings left with elevator operators, but not many, maybe right. One or two.
This building was interesting because it was kind of a seat of the pants experience for many people. But I was interested in preservation work, and this was, and Pat Fitzgerald was too. He is more a developer's architect, but very skilled with reusing historic buildings and putting them to new uses. And, a project like this, you have an appreciation of its worth to the culture. I mean, this building is, if it was gone, you wouldn't know any better, but you know that it's here, what it's worth, and what it tells about Chicago, about 19th century American culture. It's an important, transitional Victorian Gothic style in the history of Chicago in the 19th century. And, what we do is, as architects and working on historic buildings, is you come in and you read a building, you learn how to understand the things that they did, why the windows are the way they are, and how the walls function, what terracotta is, and what a commercial building is in the context of Chicago. And so this building was full of opportunities and information to read. And the thing that's nice about it is that it all kind of worked out. You had the Rosens of Sam Liquor Store that were like, yeah, we're going to move on, but we don't care if this is on the National Register, go ahead. And Tim Glasscott, coming in, jumping into, which was probably a veritable money pit. There were lots of unknowns but very visible economic disasters that this building represented. and the fact that we learned a lot as architects, how you can retrofit a new use into this building, how new technologies can be woven into the existing fabric. So it's kind of a casebook of adaptive reuse.
So how did you first become aware of the building and what was going on here?
I like the old Victorian buildings. I always liked the building. We had to make a deal with Freddie Rosen, the Rosen family, which owned basically 70% of the building, because the city had bought the front 30 feet coming back this way for potentially widening. They were supposed to widen North Avenue. They changed the plan because of the expense in widening the bridge, and because at that point Procter & Gamble was just west of the bridge. and they scrapped the plans, and in the meantime, the building became a national landmark. We were going to call it Yandorf's Phoenix, because before the Rosens bought it, it was supposed to be demolished for a new bank to be built, in which we have that rendering over there that would have been a 1930 typical granite bank building, which now we look at as old buildings.
And that time it was
That was
new and
the-
improved
that was-
building for this site.
That was your prototypical bank building.
Now,
with
there was
the-
some,
with the columns and.
After this building originally was like a German meeting hall, way
Well, it was
back when,
a men's and boys haberdashery,
and,
and basically the first floor was a commercial space. Up here, they had it was like a youth center, really, a neighborhood community center, more so, and they had a lot of functions, with the stage and this, and then they had 3 banquet rooms on the 4th floor. That has like 18-foot ceilings in there, and that's where they had the weddings and things for all the community.
all sorts of meetings and so forth.
Yeah.
The landmark status that was granted, this became a national landmark. That was done by the architects, as I recall.
That was done before we got
before we
involved.
got involved.
That's what saved the building from the city coming and ripping
So,
it
from what I
down.
understand, Phil Hamp and his architects worked with, they got
I believe they
Sam
were-
Rosen, or Fred Rosen and his brother to agree to
Right, they
let
were
them
involved
have
in
it
it.
landmarked.
Right.
Right. But then, when you did the work to restore the building, correct?
Right.
And
Right. I had 3 partners.
give us an idea as to what was entailed with restoring this building so you could get the tax benefits of being a national landmark.
Basically, as long as the outside is done normally in these situations, the outside of the building has to be restored back to what it was. Usually, you can change the inside of the building. This, because of the presidium and the balcony, this had to be saved. This was part of it. One unusual thing is the windows, we replaced all the windows, they had to be wood. Instead of, at this point, we could have used a better product. And nobody could tell the difference if you're on the 1st floor looking up here to the 2nd floor, whether it's wood or anything else. But
That was the rule.
that was the rule. But it really an interesting engineered building. We rented the 1st floor to a bank, and then the 1st floor and the basement, and then they rented the front banquet room and the back banquet room, because 2 of the higher-ups wanted corner offices.
What about the pigeons? How did you
The
get rid of the
pigeons.
pigeons?
The pigeons were just as we kept working and moving around, they kept moving them. But they're literally, we took out over 10 dumpsters of guano, pigeon excrement. Yeah, this is just a painting we actually found in the building by R. Borso. It was, as you can see, a very vibrant corner. This was a very German neighborhood, and all of up and down North Avenue. This was a rendering that we found inside the building, along with a box of postcards that showed this on the front of the postcards, this rendering, welcoming people to the new bank. Well, obviously, the crash came, and the new bank building never got built.
Steppenwolf was founded in the mid-'70s. They resided in Highland Park for the first 5 or 6 years, and then moved into the city, actually a number of locations on Halsted, not this location at 1650 North Halsted, but by then they were at, right before we moved into the building at 1650, we were at 2851 North Halsted.
Right.
And then we actually built the building here at 1650 and moved into that space. And when the building was built at the theater, it had a theater building and a rehearsal space. And then within a few years, they decided to use the rehearsal space as an acting space, as a producing space.
Sure.
And we were looking for a rehearsal space. We had rehearsed a fair amount there was some empty space over at the Royal George, where Belena is now, where the Boca restaurant is. And then I don't know how it came about, but the theater had a relationship with LaSalle Bank. LaSalle Bank had owned this building before as affiliated bank. Then LaSalle Bank, there was a branch, I believe, on the first floor. And the floors 2 and 3 were sort of left mothballed in a way. They were kind of derelict.
Right.
And then they had their offices on the 4th floor. And then we struck a deal with LaSalle they sold us floors 2, 3, and 4. And we, in exchange for that, we renovated this hall as our rehearsal space. And that was in 1998.
1998, right. What will you miss about Yandorf?
Well, I mean, I'll miss this room. This is a very special, this has a lot of memories in it for a lot of the company.
Yes,
It has a lot of memories in it for me.
Yes.
Again, the great productions of the last 20 years have all originated from this
Started
space.
here, right.
And I was hired about 30 days before we broke ground on the space.
Yes.
In the Water Tower Waterworks. So I wasn't a part of the design process, but I was part of construction and living in that historic building.
All right. So how that must have been such a nice move or transition for you then to come here.
It was, because when I started here, we had our offices in the building, so we were on the 4th floor, and one of the great advantages of the building, it's one of the tallest buildings before the building of Sono. It was one of the tallest buildings, on this side, so you could really see downtown.
Right.
You could see a lot, pretty far to the north, to the west, to the south.
Right.
So it's a great space, and we definitely. We will miss it. This city has an incredible love of theater, and I think that's probably that is one of the most unique aspects of the city from a theater person's perspective. This town loves its theater and supports theater, and it's why there are more than 200 theater companies in the city, and it's why Steppenwolf is the company that it is. There are no theater companies like Steppenwolf in this entire country. And that is because there's no city like Chicago in this entire country.
Right. And I think actually, wouldn't you say that Yandorf sort of speaks to that here it was built, a hidden gem, that who would know that on the 2nd and 3rd floor of this amazing building that there was this theater that I believe their history is that private groups could come in and have performances and so forth.
We are in the kind of quiet phase of raising money for an expansion to our facility. The expansion will include a replacement of the upstairs theater.
Yes.
So funny enough, we bought Yondarf Hall in '98 because we were using the upstairs theater for rehearsal space, and then we turned it into performance. We are now turning the upstairs theater back into rehearsal space, which is what it was designed to be.
Okay.
And replacing that performance space with a new 400-seat in the round theater.
In the round, that's right.
Which will be in the open parking lot that sits between the theater and the garage.
Right.
And that building will have an in-the-round space, lobby space, audience amenities, bar, et cetera. Dressing rooms, support space, physical production support space. And then on the top floor, it'll have space for education programs. Steppenwolf has kind of always been in Lincoln Park. I mean, it started, it's sort of moved a little further south at every juncture, but it's, we've always been here. I think it's obviously a service to the patrons that live in this neighborhood, but I think it's also, can't be forgotten that not so long ago, Lincoln Park wasn't the fancy neighborhood that it is now.
Exactly.
Chicago's German immigrant community engaged in a wide variety of activities. Political activists supported labor reform and workers' rights, religious leaders founded churches and aid societies, musicians and orators formed cultural and artistic circles, and everyone gathered for holiday events and outings. One of the most influential contributions of the immigrant community was the development of physical education, led prominently by the Turner or Turnverein movement, founded by Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, a movement that united physical fitness with the goals of self-respecting citizenship, German unity, and German national consciousness. Jahn is credited with the design of gymnastic equipment still in use today, including the balance beam, horizontal bar, and the vaulting horse. The Turner movement came to America with the German immigrants, particularly among the political refugees from the revolutions of 1848, and flourished in Chicago, where there were as many as 34 separate Turner societies in 1890. It is thanks to the Turner movement in America that universities and secondary schools include physical education in their programs. Turners also advocated for public parks and supported summer camps. From the beginning, Turnverein-Lincoln offered a full schedule of gymnastics classes for men and women, boys and girls. It established a singing session and amassed a library of several hundred volumes for the use of its members. In the next decades, it organized additional clubs and a wide range of member activities, including a glee club, the Lincoln Footlights, and the Drum and Bugle Corps. From its original location, the group moved north to the corner of Diversey and Sheffield. In 1919, it hosted a meeting of several Turner groups, and in 1921 began considering the construction of a new facility devoted entirely to physical education. The new building opened in 1922. The long brick and limestone structure is eclectic in style, with a pediment showing Baroque and European influences, and squares and rectangles echoing the more recent Prairie style. This combination of European and American, old and new designs offered more ample space for the Turners. In addition to its very large gymnasium and pool, there were rooms for a variety of meetings and activities, and a cafe on the ground floor where diners could enjoy a taste of the old country. And gymnasts might finish their strenuous sessions with a beer. For many local families, Lincoln Turner Hall was as much a site for social and recreational gathering as for physical training. As the German character of the neighborhood changed and the rise of National Socialism in Germany widened the gap between German Americans and their home country, membership in the gym changed too. Following a period of declining membership, the hall was renovated in the 1980s. Today, new generations of children and adults from a diverse neighborhood come to Lincoln Turner Hall for classes, exercise, and fun. The long and varied history of the building is represented here by historian John Jentz, trainer David Roth, and Heinz Broderson, a longtime Lincoln Turner member.
The Turner movement is extraordinarily difficult for somebody here in the early 21st century to understand. It really is hard. And they are not primarily a gymnastics society. They are not, that's not their main thing. They started in, of all things, 1811 in Germany as a liberal political movement. The Turner movement was inherently both political and you got to mix in cultural at the same time. And in a way that's perhaps peculiar to Germans in Central Europe, the physical fitness gymnastics thing fit into the larger political goals. And the larger political goals was basically they wanted to found a German republic. If you wanted to find an American in a kind of quick, simple, legalistic way, it's very simple. An American is a citizen of the American nation state. And the American nation state has been around for a long time, and it has clear borders that haven't moved in a long time, right? And you can just, Americans, in a legalistic sense, they're citizens of this country. German nation states have come and gone. We used to have two up until 1989. And now we have one, but there were two, and then there was an empire, and then before the empire, there was like 30-odd little principalities and stuff. And the point is simply that the defining who are Germans and what is German culture is very tricky, and it's much more difficult. Every Turner society was basically they had singing societies, they had libraries quite often, they had they taught people how to do speeches. They thought that they were forming the citizens of the yet-to-be German Republic. The Turner societies were, especially after Haymarket within the United States, and also especially after the foundation of the German Empire in 1871, started to divide politically in a way that they hadn't been before the Civil War. I mean, when everybody's trying to found the German Republic, a lot of differences could get papered over into we're all going to be the citizens and soldiers of the new republic. But then Bismarck ends up uniting Germany under a reactionary monarchy in 1871. And a lot of people, a lot of Germans, really liked a unified Germany, even if they had to swallow the pill of a reactionary monarchy running the place. And you had groups, political groups, and among them the Turner societies, started to filter out into a pro-German Empire, not so happy with the German Empire, actually opposed to the German Empire, depending on their political views in the United States.
I'm Miles Harvey, one of the members of the Lincoln Park Initiative, and I'm really honored to be interviewing David Roth and Heinz Brodersen about the Lincoln Turners. And I thought we might start with some personal histories. David, could you tell us how long you've been sort of in the know about this group, and just your family story and just how you got involved?
I got involved back in the early 60s. I'd met somebody diving and they did gymnastics, and I went to a gymnastics class to improve my diving and fell in love with gymnastics, and it was at the Ike Turner Hall in Roseland, Illinois, in Chicago. And my family ended up all becoming Turner members, and my brothers and I kind of grew up taking gym classes at Ike Turner's, and then later in life I ended up working and teaching at Lincoln Turner's in Chicago.
When I came out of the Army, I was 25 years old, and I couldn't touch the ground anymore when I bent down. I was getting stiff, I felt, and so I joined Lincoln Turner's. It was just the good way for the Germans get together, and of course after gym, then you always had a beer and bragged how well you did. You would do your workout. Afterward, we would play volleyball, and then after that, we would go downstairs in a dungeon, we called it, and had a beer or two, and sang some songs, German and American songs.
I would teach the class when I started there, and Heinz was one of the students. And the men would come in, and they'd be like, waiting for the teacher to go, okay, line up. And the men would all line up, and you did marching drills that led into formation so that you could do your exercises, and everybody was equally spaced. And oftentimes there was a piano player that accompanied your exercise, and you did
Mrs.
Sinke, and she played the piano so that you could exercise, and you did calisthenics. Half the people spoke German, half the people spoke English, and half the people wore lederhosen and dirndls and in their German costumes, and it was just a fun time, a fun place to be. And for gymnastics as a sport in the United States, but more importantly, it began physical education in the United States. That it was the Turners that put playground equipment on playgrounds. It was the Turners that developed a physical education system that then became adopted by all the universities, first by Indiana University and then by every university, and which is how we ended up having physical education as part of our curriculum from grammar school all the way through high school as being an important aspect of our lives. I think what's really neat, specifically with the Lincoln Turner Hall, is that it was a place for social but physical education and activities. And the new owners now, the second owners of the Turner Hall, is a health club. And so they're doing similar things. I mean, they've taken what the Turners started, and it has become a phenomenon in the United States. Not only do we have the physical education in our schools, but we have what are now health clubs where you can go in and do all these things on machines rather than on apparatus. So it's nice that its reuse is still for physical fitness. It's nostalgic to kind of go back in there, but you go back in there and you don't recognize the place. It's the Lincoln Charter that was signed, admitted to the American Turners organization, September 1922 to October 1925.
And what are we looking at?
1925 to 1930. These were published books. These are actually Heinz's.
Well, the Lincoln Turners. I just have them.
They're Lincoln Turners.
Yeah.
They just they had ads from neighborhood things. They kind of recorded what was going on in the neighborhood and with the Turner Hall, and so this is regarding the Louisville gymnastics tournament that was being held. There were Turner Halls. There was 50 different Turner organizations, 100 Turner organizations in the Chicago area.
Well, that is actually the new hall that was built.
Wow.
Lincoln Turner Hall, yeah. Here you can see all the people with the same uniform, large classes.
From the 1920s.
Yeah.
Tell us when you got this.
I got that in '06, I think. And in '06 I was a 40-year member. That's when I had to. That's when I didn't have to pay dues anymore. After 40 years.
Those are the Chicago Turner pioneers. Who are they?
Those would be the founders, kind of.
Oh, okay.
That I believe is inside the restaurant. It's a ladies' gymnastics class in the 20s and 30s. Men's gymnastics class from 1930s.
And Heinz, when we're looking at these pictures, does this look pretty much like the gym looked during your time? Had it changed much?
Yeah. Pretty much the same.
Performing at the World's Fair.
I wasn't in on that one.
By the 1920s, Lincoln Park was home not only to German Americans, but to a growing and diverse population. Its proximity to the lake and the park attracted the well-to-do, who sought elegant living away from the tonier worlds of the Gold Coast and the commercial spaces of downtown. An important architectural innovation of the period, the apartment hotel, was ideally suited to building sites along Lincoln Park. Charles Henry Lott of Lott Hotels built 3 apartment hotels along Lincoln Park West, and the finest, most elegant of the 3 was the Belden Apartment Hotel, which opened on October 21st, 1923. Lott gave the design assignment for this northernmost and most elegant apartment hotel to Meyer Fridstein, who had come to Chicago after studying engineering at the University of Wisconsin and had served as the in-house architect for the real estate developer G.H. Gottschalk. Fridstein gave Lott's building a gracious Beaux-Arts style, adding a Second Empire mansard roof in purple terracotta and extensive terracotta classical ornamentation. The building's U-shape allowed for fine views of the park and lake for most of its apartment units, and its name quickly became the Belden Stratford, perhaps to honor the statue of Shakespeare in the park just opposite. Apartment hotels in the early 20th century were of 2 types. One appealing to younger people and offering balconies and rooftop dining, and the second appealing to upper middle class and wealthy patrons who sought opulence and excellent service. Lott's Belden Hotel, definitely in the second category, offered its tenants every convenience, including maid service, while retaining all the pleasures and conveniences of your own home. By the time the $4 million property opened, 95% of its bachelor, 1- and 2-bedroom apartments, some with kitchenettes, had been leased. The apartment hotel gave its tenants the option of staying for short or long terms, in furnished or unfurnished apartments. Tenants might eat in the tea room or dining room, or even pick up groceries in the Belden food shop. Some residents might have a furniture suite from Marshall Field & Company, and the kitchenette units came with an automatic electric cooking stove and a Frigidaire system refrigerator, all part of the modern, elegant yet carefree life by the park. Change came to the Belden Stratford too, of course. Lott's 1925 divorce and subsequent departure from Chicago left his properties in the hands of his ex-wife and business partners, and in 1930, the Lott Hotel properties went into receivership. When the Webster Hotel and the Belden Stratford were finally put up for auction in 1954, Lott's $4 million jewel was sold for $1.6 million. At the time, the building was listed as having 485 rooms, including 120 kitchenettes. The Beaux-Arts building remained attractive even as it aged, and it continued to offer hotel apartment living until 2011, when the last 68 hotel units were taken off the market and joined the remaining 229 apartment units offered for rent. Significantly, the layout and floor plans of the units had changed little through later renovations. Lott's original vision, as achieved by Fridstein, has had considerable staying power. Recent renovation has also restored much of the elegance of the Belden Stratford lobby, which still greets visitors with the grandeur and charm of the 1920s. We tell the story of this lovely Beaux-Arts building in the words of Ward Miller from Preservation Chicago and from the former manager of the apartment hotel, Janice Greenberg.
The Belden Stratford is an apartment hotel. It was built in the 1920s, I believe 1923, by Meyer Friedstein. And Friedstein was educated at the University of Wisconsin and worked with Richard E. Schmidt, who had a very notable career in Chicago, Schmidt and Garden, and was also involved with Marshall and Fox in several projects, including the Blackstone Hotel, which is another landmark in Chicago, and one of those great hotels dating from the early part of the 20th century.
When we talk about him doing this as an apartment hotel, maybe you could tell us exactly what that means.
Sure. So apartment hotels were kind of a new concept during this age. And you see it throughout Chicago, you just have to sort of look for it. But it was a full service residential building and hotel that offered a staff. They had maid service, they had clerks that would answer phones and take messages for you, and a variety of great services and amenities that one would find perhaps only if they had a staff working for them. And so you basically had the hotel staff working for you. And they had, fabulous lobbies and ballrooms and spaces. And it was a perfect place for, a couple or an individual or a small family to live. And they were very economical, and of course, it also provided security. Whereas if you had a large house, let's say nearby on Lincoln Park West or Lakeshore Drive West or Fullerton Parkway, you would have had to have hired all these people. And it also commanded quite a presence from Lincoln Park or any vistas. You'd look at this marvelously beautiful building, and it sort of take your breath away. And this also was really one of the first hotels and buildings of this scale and size fronting Lincoln Park. So it's kind of like a street wall. It was a backdrop for this marvelous park, and of course a beautiful Beaux-Arts style building. This was an amazingly big city, and there were plans from the early years that were rethought and brought together in Burnham's 1909 plan. So this would be Daniel Burnham's 1909 plan for the city of Chicago, which really thought of waterways and lakefronts and parks in a different way that had not really been seen on this scale before, especially in America. We saw hints of it in New York with Central Park from the 1870s, But Lincoln Park became an idea to be able to escape the hectic city life and to be able to refresh and regenerate oneself. And so these park projects became quite amazing. One would have encountered more of a typical hotel room of proportions that one would see maybe today, to 2 rooms and suites and connecting rooms and those kinds of things. So you would have had a variety of different floor plans and very flexible. And this was common of a lot of hotels and long-term residential hotels that one would have seen. I think we think of hotels today as a place where one stays for a day or 2 or a weekend, but these were long stay hotels, if you will, and they were done in with marvelous type of grandiose architecture and comfort, and all the pleasantries were brought in, and one didn't have to shovel 100 pounds of coal to heat one's house or apartment, as you may have done about that time. So a lot of the amenities that we take for granted now would have been an amazing part of this whole package. So it was really a world within a world, if you will, or a city within a city, with dry cleaners or a laundry and maid service as part of the whole package, and of course phone answering service. So all of these things together, and heating, and some of them, like the early theaters, may have even had air conditioning at one point. So all of those features were combined into these ideas. And you saw this most prominently here, and in places like the Drake Hotel, which also had the Drake Tower alongside of it, which is part of the landmark district on East Lakeshore Drive, and buildings like the Shoreland and Hyde Park, and another spectacular hotel type arrangements. And you even found later on that apartment buildings were mimicking some of these services.
I don't know if we can classify if there's a different type of person who would opt to live there today, is even in the Gloria Swanson time, or it's hard to categorize.
It really is hard to categorize. I think the Belden Stratford has always maybe kept up with the time, so to speak. This neighborhood did develop sort of after the beginnings of the 20th century. It was lined with a lot of very stately houses and mansions and row houses that you still see throughout the neighborhood. And then that transitioned into smaller apartment buildings, 3 to 5 story buildings, and then into this type of structure. And the people that were in the Belden Stratford, I think, held on. They were pretty well to do in general. I'm sure there were people that were struggling, as a lot of people were during the Depression. But this hotel didn't have the, and this little strip of Lincoln Park was always really well known as a strip that held the sifted few, as they oftentimes said about Prairie Avenue, right? I mean, with the, how could you go wrong? It had this beautiful park. It would never be built on, or you'd never have your view obstructed. You have these beautiful trees. You had one of the nation's earliest zoos there, right? Lincoln Park Zoo, a conservatory that dates to the end of the 19th century, and all sorts of plants and fauna, and these beautiful lagoons. And it was always a destination, and I think it was always a recognized destination. Whereas if you got a little west of Clark Street or west of Halsted, you may have been in a different, more broader economic base of people. But certainly on Lincoln Park West, this was the creme de la creme, as they would sometimes say, a term I hate to use, but I think it sort of fits it all pretty well.
I worked for a company that specialized in buying the buildings that were built in the 20s, that after the Second World War were in pretty bad shape. And we did buy several and rehab them. And the man who was the head of this was named Leonard Richmond, and he wrote a wonderful paper that you should find called Architectural Rebirth. and it was about giving new life to these old buildings. The Belden was the last property that we bought and the last one we developed. And we did a lot of work. The building was not in good shape when we bought it. It was pretty empty. And we did a very extensive rehab. But we did a lot of restoration of the public areas. We didn't change any of the old things. And it proved to be very successful. It's a wonderful, warm building. It was a little village. It was very nice. We also believe strongly in providing certain amenities. We always had a brunch for our residents twice a year. We always had New Year's Eve parties. And our Mr. Richmond used to say that no little old lady would be alone on New Year's Eve in his buildings. He did. And we had wonderful sit-down dinners with orchestras and dance acts and ventriloquists. It was really something. Over the years, there were people who would rent a whole half of a floor. They would, and some of them, of course, were very prominent people because they loved living where they could pick up a phone and say, change my sofa. I want a different pillow. That it was all service. The residents, of course, came from a huge base. All kinds of people lived in all of our buildings. But the most constant resident would be some husband who was leaving his wife and needed a place to stay. They would always find us because we were furnished and we had maid service. Switchboards were 24 hours and they were everybody's lifeline. Then all of a sudden, gone, not wanted. Everybody had a cell phone. The change was just tremendous. The ballroom was gone already when we bought the building, but it was just very popular for weddings, bar mitzvah, sweet 16. But the catering was huge. But that all changed with cars. You had to have places to park, and there were no places to park around here. It was already jammed up, right? There were approximately 300. A few over 300, varying from studios to 2-bedroom. Yeah, they were lovely, spacious units, bright, sunny. It's a marvelous, marvelous building.
Apartments, you said?
All unfurnished, long-term rentals. It's an apartment building, absolutely. And we did as many plans as we could think of. Yeah. With very labor intensive. To run a furnished building is very hard.
Well, Janice, you have made such a clear picture in all of our heads, I think, of the Belden Stratford.
I hope so. The units were wonderful. The building was wonderful. I knew every little nook and corner, and that was the beauty of these old buildings, that it had nooks and corners.